Hello everyone, and welcome back to World of Warships Blitz with Terry. Today we will be looking at one of the most asked questions in the comment section. Because, as you know, there are two types of ammo in the game. There's high explosive and there's armor piercing. And people seem to be very confused about when to use what. And I admit this is not very obvious, and it is also really important. Because it can make or break your battle if you're using the wrong ammunition type against the wrong target. Makes a huge difference. So today we'll start probably a 3 or 4 part series and go through in more detail the different ammunition types, the different calibers, and when to use which one. Just so I don't have to keep replying to comments and explaining it, because there's always a lot of work to type that up. And I think it's just generally a good thing for everybody to be aware of these things and to know them, because they're really not that obvious, especially if you're new to the game. So we will start out, because we've done a lot of light cruisers in the recent videos and destroyer and stuff. So we'll start out with heavy cruisers. Now, heavy cruisers have usually around 200mm main guns. And before we go any further, let's have a quick look at the battle wiki, which is actually in game, and there's a shell section. I know we've done this before, but again, this is really important to understand and keep that in mind. What is the difference between the two types of shells? There are armor-piercing shells and high-explosive shells. Armor-piercing shells have higher penetration. Their fuses are set up such that they need to penetrate a certain amount of armor to activate. So they are there to get through a ship's armor and then explode ideally inside the ship. When that happens, you get a penetration for 100% damage. When you can't get through the armor, you get a half penetration or semi-pen for 50% damage. When there isn't enough armor for the fuse to properly activate, it will not explode. It'll make a hole in the ship, but it'll just go straight through and come out the other side again. That is an overpenetration and only does 25% of damage. And if there's too much of armor, then the shell will ricochet and bounce off and won't do any damage whatsoever. The high explosive shells don't have the last two, and that is really the most important difference. High explosive shells will always cause damage. They'll either go through the armor and penetrate and do 100% damage. If they have less penetration power than armor piercing, but they can do that. Or if they don't make it through the armor, they will explode, because they're high explosives. They explode in the middle, halfway through somewhere, and they'll do 50% for a semi-pen. They do not overpen, and they do not ricochet. So ideally, we always want our shells to do 100% damage, because that is a huge difference, right? Imagine your shell does 1,000 points of damage. If you do an overpen, you only do 250 damage. So we want to get a full penetration, ideally, and at least a semi-penetration. What we want to avoid is overpenetration and ricochet. Now you could say, oh, you could just fire high explosive all the time. Well, no, it's not that simple. So that's what we're getting into. Now, this thing here, sorry, let me just quickly tell people that I'm busy. Okay, so the thing that we've got here is the Miyoko, the tier 7 Japanese heavy cruiser. We don't care about her other things. We just care about her guns. She has 203mm main guns. She has 10 main guns, and they do 690 points of base damage or alpha damage on the high explosive and 805 points on the armor piercing. Now, it will be, obviously, if we get a full penetration with armor piercing, we're not going to do 805 points of damage. We're going to do less damage, because there's a certain damage reduction that every ship has. But whatever damage reduction percentage they have, if we do a full penetration with the armor piercing, we do a little bit less than 800 points of damage. And we only do about under 700 with the high explosives. So what kind of targets then do we want to fire high explosives at? And what kind of targets do we want to fire armor piercing at? Well, we want to fire armor piercing at everything that we can reliably penetrate. Not over penetrate and not bounce off. So we want to fire it at things that don't have too much or too little armor. Let's go into a battle, and I'll try and kind of show you what I mean. Okay, we've got battleships, a cruiser, and destroyers. Now, keep the base values in mind that we've just seen, 800 and 690 for the high explosive. And we will see what kind of targets we're finding. Now, the game pre-selects armor piercing for you for a 200mm caliber. And that depends, again, if we want to keep that, it depends what we're shooting at. Okay, let's go. So we're on armor piercing, but we're going to see destroyers, probably, or battleships. Now, there's more to this than just the kind of ship. It's also about the distance. You want to make sure that you want to make sure that you're firing at the right distance, because the longer your shot goes, the less penetration it has. Armor piercing loses penetration power over time, probably high explosive as well. So we don't want to fire armor piercing at things that are extremely close and have very little armor, like destroyers. We also don't want to fire armor piercing at things that are extremely far away and have a lot of armor, like battleships. So I'm going to switch over to the high explosive. Just going to get around this island. Now, why am I switching? Either I'm going to see destroyers at close range, in which case I'm going to use my high explosive against them, or I'm going to see this battleship here, the Colorado, and I'm going to fire my high explosive at them because, again, it's a battleship, and at this range, my armor piercing would not reliably penetrate. You see, my high explosive sometimes penetrates, sometimes semi-pens, but what I want to achieve here is to set a fire. Now he extinguishes the fire, and I'm just gonna keep firing at him. And I'm trying to get another fire in. Oh, he's dodged my torpedoes. And he's at 5 kilometers. I'm just trying to get another fire in, but there comes a destroyer. Now here I'm gonna have to be careful. At this distance, about 6 kilometers, I could fire armor piercing at the destroyer. So I'm gonna switch over my ammunition type. I have to dodge his torpedoes. My high explosive does a lot of damage because the destroyer has very little armor. So I'm always guaranteed. But let's see what the armor piercing can do. You see that? We've got some semi-pens and we've got some reliable full pens at this distance with the armor piercing. Now the destroyer smokes up. I'm switching back over to the high explosive because there was a battleship somewhere here. I don't know where he went. Oh, he got sunk. Okay. Then there's actually no reason for me to be over here, and I need to actually turn around and go to the other side. Or rush the cap, maybe. Of course, we have both cruisers over here, and there's still a destroyer. So, back to armor piercing, because that destroyer over there is far away enough that I'm not going to overpenetrate him with my armor piercing shells. And the other target I have over there is a carrier. Oh, and there's a Gneisenau. Now let's see what happens when I'm shooting the armor piercing at the Gneisenau at this distance. So I am going to switch back to the high explosive. And you see, I've got some penetrations, but some of my shots, they didn't do that much damage because of the armor of the Gneisenau. I couldn't do... I do almost as much damage with the high explosive. And I have a much better chance of setting a fire. There's the destroyer again. So at this distance, we could fire armor piercing, but since I've got the high explosive loaded anyway and he's on low health, I'm just gonna fire out at him, and he gets super lucky not to get deleted, but somebody else takes him out. And again, I am probably doing about as much damage with the high explosive, but I set fires. Look at this. I set 3 fires on that Gneisenau. And that means this shot should take him out. There he goes. You see, my high explosive does semi-pens because the armor of the Gneisenau obviously is not enough for the penetration of the high explosive. It still does a lot of damage though, because my armor piercing would do semi-pens as well, or even bounce. So for a ship like this Japanese ship, the overpenetration from the high explosive make a lot of sense because of the very good fire chance, and you've just seen it, right? I've set 5 fires so far in this ship, and the fires do damage over time. So this is a very good choice in general for the ship to just stick to high explosive if you're not sure. If you need to have just this extra little bit of damage and you fire at targets like, say, destroyers, and or you fire at light cruisers, which are very weakly armored, that is a situation when you can use armor piercing. Just be aware that when you get too close to a destroyer, then your armor piercing will overpenetrate and you're going to need to switch over to high explosive. Now, as the battle goes, I haven't really focused on the battle, to be honest. I haven't paid too much attention. But I don't think we're going to win that still. Unless I can sink something very, very quickly. Oh, there's the Sims. I could take out the Sims. But I don't have enough time. Let's see if the high explosive is enough. No, it's not enough to take him out. Would have had to have a much better hit to get the Sims out. Then we could have still won that. But that's what I was kind of trying to do. But you get the idea, right? So with the 200mm shells, you want to use armor piercing against targets that you can reliably penetrate. So other light cruisers, things at very close range, probably not battleships, but that's possible to do as well. And destroyers at long range. Now at long range, because at close range, your armor piercing penetration is too great that you're actually just going to shoot through them, you're going to get over penetrations. So the high explosive is a much more reliable choice here because it will do almost as much damage to destroyers, not quite as much, and you don't have to think about it that much. So with a Japanese cruiser like this, unless you've got an enemy light cruiser at close range, I would almost always stick with the high explosive. Let's go to a slightly different ship. Something on the other side of the spectrum. All right, so this is the Admiral Hipper, the Tier 8 German heavy cruiser. And we'll have a look at her guns. She also gets 203mm main guns. She only gets 8. She does 590 HE base damage in comparison to the 690 on the Japanese cruiser. She only has a 6% chance of setting fire as compared to the 10% chance on the Miyoko. But she does 991 armor piercing alpha damage, which is almost 200 more than the Miyoko. So you'll find that in German ships in general, that the armor piercing is very good. In return, the high explosive is usually not that great. So in which situations are we going to use high explosive armor piercing? Now remember, for the Miyoko, which has the same caliber of guns, I've said it's a good basic bet to just stick with the high explosive. With the Admiral Hipper, that's a different story. Just because of the very low base damage that the high explosive does, and the lower fire chance, and the increased damage that the armor piercing does, it is often a good idea with the Hipper to stick with the armor piercing in general and fire that. So let's try that out. Now, remember the base values, right? So because of the very high alpha damage on the armor piercing, even a semi-pen on an armor piercing shot will do almost as much as a full pen on the high explosive with the Hipper's guns. But the only situation where I would not use the armor piercing and I would switch to the high explosive is if I fire at something that is at extremely close range and that I am almost guaranteed to overpen. So the destroyer. My base rule of thumb really is around 6 kilometers. So if a destroyer is at 6 kilometers or further, I can usually use the armor piercing for more effect. If they are closer than 6 kilometers, I switch to the high explosive. So and the same goes again for the Hipper. If I have to fight a destroyer at close range, I would switch over to the high explosive just because I'm guaranteed, almost guaranteed full pens, and I'm most likely to overpen with the armor piercing. And even though the armor piercing almost does 1,000 damage, an overpen only does 250, whereas a full pen with the high explosive will do more damage. So let's see if we can find ourselves something to shoot at. Okay, there's a Benson. Now the Benson is at closer than 6 already, so I'm going to switch over to the high explosive. Also, I seem to have completely missed that thing. I have to dodge these torps here. You see, I do very reliable full pens with the high explosive against that Benson. Against the Benson bot. Now the Benson is moving away, so I'm going to switch back over to the armor piercing. And see what we can do at 8 kilometer range. And I just got lapped by a battleship. Yeah, you see, these actually were semi-pens, which is quite surprising on a Benson. I seem to have lost one of my turrets. There's the full pens. At that range, I can reliably do damage against that ship. Okay, now that Colorado over there, usually I would say, oh, we're going to use high explosive. But let's see what the armor piercing of this thing can do. A full pen does over 800 damage. We got a couple of bounces, so yeah, that is not too great, even with the Admiral Hipper. The Hipper is not a ranged ship, so at this range, the armor piercing does not do reliable damage. Semi-pens, bounces. So when we're shooting at the Colorado at this range, it is not a great idea to use the armor piercing. Well, it isn't such a great idea to use the high explosive either, but we're not really doing anything with the armor piercing against the Colorado. So we can do the two things. We can get closer, or we can start using the high explosive. I don't like using the high explosive on German battleships because of the very low alpha damage and the low fire chance. And we're doing semi-pens with the high explosive, but at least we are doing reliable semi-pens and not... okay, there's a Duca. Different target. Switch over to the armor piercing. Why? Duca is a light cruiser. Light cruiser is a very thinly armored ship. So we want to use the armor piercing because we can pretty much do bad damage to him. And see, we get mostly full pens. Well, that's one more salvo if he survives. No, he doesn't. Now the problem, of course, is now that we are very close to an Alabama, which is not a good thing to be. But he has beached himself, so we're going to use our torps and hope that we can survive long enough to get out of here. And at this range, you see, we can even score a citadel at this range against an American battleship with our armor piercing guns. So it's all about the distance, right? At 8 kilometers, we were not super effective. Now we're at 6 kilometers. We are starting to be less effective. The problem is I'm in a cruiser. I can't brawl a battleship. So as soon as I get a little bit further away, I'm going to have to start switching back to the high explosive again. But I'll see at which point I stop doing reliable damage. And you see we are down to semi-pens. We're getting up to 8 kilometers. That's when we started bouncing off the Colorado, and there we go. We start bouncing. So I'm switching over to high explosive because at this point, at this distance, my shells don't have sufficient penetration to reliably penetrate, to reliably do damage. They bounce off because they're traveling through the air has reduced their penetration sufficiently that they're not getting through anymore. Now, the high explosive doesn't penetrate either, but the difference being that the high explosive can't bounce. And I don't do a lot of damage, but at least I do damage rather than just bouncing the shells off. So if I'm shooting at a battleship at this range and I don't have enough health to brawl her right now, I'm going to be using the high explosive. And one more salvo. Plus there is... Oh, ouch, there's a Colorado there. So we need to turn. Can somebody please kill the Alabama so I don't do... Oh, there we go. Okay, Colorado is at full health. He's the last ship alive, so... we may as well just go in at this point. Since I'm charging him, since I'm charging him, I'm going to switch back to the armor piercing. Is he in torp range? Not yet. So I'm going to charge him head on. And at this range, I'm starting to do full pens again. Now, I'm not going to hit him with torps anymore. But look at the guns. There we go, with semi-pens at least, because I hit something sturdy. But I do damage with the armor piercing at this range. Now, a couple of seconds longer, I would have been able to torpedo this thing. So this is the difference, right? On a ship like the Hipper, you totally have to be aware what your target is and what your distance is. Remember, we were firing at the Colorado at what, 8-9 kilometers? The armor piercing would just bounce off. We did almost no damage to that ship with the armor piercing. When we got closer to the broadsiding Alabama, who had pulled a knot and run into that island, and we were firing at under 6 kilometers, we scored a citadel with our armor piercing because we were closer and it had higher penetration. So if we were firing at a destroyer at close range with the armor piercing, it would have overpenetrated. So that, in my opinion, makes heavy cruisers among the most difficult to play, because you constantly have to be aware of what you're shooting at, how much armor they're having, and how close you are. So are you shooting at a lightly armored target? Are you shooting at a destroyer at 6 kilometers or less? You probably want to switch over to the high explosive. Are you shooting at a light cruiser at any distance? You want to stick to the armor piercing because they have just enough armor to arm your fuses, and you do massive amounts of damage to them. Are you shooting at a battleship at long range? You're probably just going to bounce the armor piercing off them. Are you shooting at a closer range? You can score a citadel with the armor piercing. So you see the difference, right, between my armor piercing salvo at the Colorado at 8 kilometers, which did nothing to like under 1,000 damage, and my armor piercing salvo at the Alabama at 6 kilometers, which did thousands of points of damage. So that's just a matter of experience that you have to learn. Also, not all ships are equal. Some ships have more armor, some ships have less armor. This general rule of thumb: if you're shooting at lightly armored stuff, extremely lightly armored stuff like destroyers, at high explosive is always a safe bet, because you will always do full damage on destroyers. If you're shooting at light cruisers, armor piercing is almost always a safe bet because they have big citadels and you're pretty much guaranteed that you're making that you're doing massive damage. If you're shooting at heavy cruisers, it depends, right? If you're in a Miyoko, I'd fire armor piercing, fire high explosive unless we're point blank range. In a Hipper, I might go with the armor piercing against the heavy cruiser. If you're firing at battleships, again, it depends, right? Are you firing at a Japanese battleship? Are you firing at an American battleship? What range are you firing at? So you constantly have to be aware of these things and choices. So just observe what your shells are doing, because the only way you're going to learn this is through experience. Observe what your shells are doing. If you remember how much damage they should be making on a full penetration, because if we go back here, a full penetration does 100% of damage. So if your shell does 990 alpha damage and the ship has a 10% damage reduction, you're doing about 900 points of damage that you should expect to happen. If you get half of them, you did a half pen. If you only get a quarter of them, you get an over pen. If you get nothing, you did a ricochet. So you will see how your shells work, and then just observe at what distance am I firing, what am I firing at, what ship am I in, and you will learn over time what the right selection of ammunition is to do these things. And I mean, at the end of the day, almost all salvos do damage. So if you've already got armor piercing loaded, by all means, fire it and switch over afterwards rather than wasting the shots that you got in the barrels, and just go for it. Other than that, yeah, don't despair. Practice, observe, learn how your ship behaves, how it behaves against different targets, and you can see how much of a difference in terms of damage this can make. Like if you're close to a destroyer and the destroyer is rushing and chasing and attacking you, and your fire armor piercing at it with 200mm guns, and you only do 250 damage per shot because they're all over penetrating, you could have done twice that much damage. You could have survived rather than being torpedoed. That is the difference the selection of ammunition can make. Next time, we're going to look at, well, we still have to look at the battleship guns and the light cruiser guns and maybe the destroyer guns. So we'll see which one we do next time. That's it for today. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Bye.